Hey guys, welcome to this episode of Fast Keto. Today I'm thrilled to have Dr. Paul Mason joining us from Australia. It's such a great conversation. We're going to jump right into that very first question with Dr. Paul Mason.
And there's been a really neat study where they had ladies who were iron deficient and they gave them an iron infusion and they didn't give them any instructions on diet or exercise at all. And they just monitored them and they all lost weight. They all lost inches off their waist. They lost body fat. And if anything, their muscles improved. So what does this tell us? This tells us that iron is essential for energy expenditure. But here's the thing. You can have something that mimics iron deficiency, and that thing is inflammation. So what actually happens is we've actually evolved being exposed to pathogens. And if we have an infection, our body wants to react by saying, well, this bacteria actually needs iron to survive, so I'm going to lock my iron stores away and prevent it from being accessed by this pathogen, and that will help my immune system eradicate this pathogen. And this is a very sensible thing to do because it means that we get rid of infection quicker. Now, the problem is we've evolved with infections causing inflammation, but we haven't evolved with autoimmune disease. That's largely a modern disease.
Right.
And unfortunately, when we're inflamed from an autoimmune disease, the body responds as though it's an infection. And it responds by saying, okay, I've got this, I'm inflamed, I'm going to lock my iron stores away. The problem is that the state of inflammation from an autoimmune problem is usually prolonged. And by locking the iron stores away, we're not just preventing pathogens from accessing it, we're also preventing our body from accessing it. So if you have a chronic inflamed state, it's what we call a functional iron deficiency. And here it gets a little bit tricky because the iron gets stored in a protein molecule called ferritin. And this ferritin molecule is actually what most doctors will measure in the blood test to see if you have enough iron stores. But this ferritin will also increase when you're inflamed. Basically, what will happen is whatever iron is coming into the body will say, I'm just going to stuff it right inside this ferritin molecule. And your ferritin stores will increase and increase and increase. So you might have a very high store of iron, but that doesn't reflect your body's capacity to access that iron. So the availability of the iron bears no resemblance at all to what the store is. And most doctors will look at a ferritin and say, oh, that's high, you've got plenty of iron, that can't be a problem. And yet you can still have problems with accessing it. And we call this anemia of chronic inflammation or something like that. We know that some people, if they're chronically inflamed, it will lead to a functional iron deficiency. Their body can't use the iron, you make less red blood cells, the red blood cells get smaller, you get tired, etc., etc. And if you're on a ketogenic diet and you're still inflamed because there's certain foods that you can still consume on a ketogenic diet that we know provoke inflammation, and your listeners will probably be familiar with this term of a lectin. So things like nightshade vegetables, we're often consuming capsicum or bell peppers, we have chili peppers, we'll have eggplant or aubergine. So these kind of things are very rich in lectins. We'll often have a lot of nuts. People don't realize that cashew nuts, walnuts, they're actually seeds. They contain a lot of lectins. Peanuts, they're actually legumes. They contain a lot of potentially inflammatory lectins. So people on keto diets will still often be consuming a lot of these chemicals. So lectins are actually carbohydrate binding proteins that will trigger an inflammatory response. That will then mean that even though you have sky-high stores of iron in the body can't use the iron and effectively you're iron deficient. But here's the kicker. This is only thinking about it in terms of energy expenditure. It also has a massive, massive impact on our eating behaviors. And this is something that very few people understand because iron is essential for the synthesis of neurotransmitters. So neurotransmitters is the currency on which our brain operates. This is the serotonin, this is the noradrenaline, this is the dopamine. So if you have a chronically inflamed state where the iron's being locked away, that also means you are deficient in neurotransmitters. Your brain is not functioning. If you feel like you're in a brain fog, and you're in a chronically inflamed state. So people classically with celiac disease, for instance, will describe this brain fog. That almost certainly is a neurotransmitter deficiency. And the very interesting thing is, if we take dopamine, one of these neurotransmitters we know that you need iron to synthesize, this is involved in the mesolimbic pathway, the reward pathway of the brain. So if you do something pleasurable, the reason you perceive it as being rewarding or fulfilling is because dopamine is being released. And if you are deficient in dopamine, that is effectively depression. So I believe the most important diagnostic feature in depression, if we have a look at the diagnostic criteria, is one we call anhedonia. So anhedonia is loss of pleasure with everyday activities. You know, let's see, you get up in the morning and you see your dog comes running up to you, you pat him and I feel good. If you lose the inherent pleasure in that, that would be consistent with anhedonia. And I think this is more valuable than feeling sad to diagnose depression, because it might be just reactive. You know, you might have lost your, you know, had something happen to somebody you loved or something like that. There might be a reason that you feel sad, but if you lose pleasure with these kind of things, anhedonia, I think that's a very good correlate for dopamine deficiency. So now think about it. You're chronically inflamed, your body can't use the iron, you're not making dopamine, so you're just existing in a gray cloud. So what do? You self-medicate. How can you self-medicate? Well, if I have something sweet, then I might just try and get that little bit of extra stimulus out of my brain. I might just punch a little bit of the residual dopamine that I have left and lift that gray cloud, that gray veil for a few moments. That's self-medicating. And it's very predictable and very understandable. If you're effectively in a depressed state, then it's reasonable that you want to escape from it from time to time. And a lot of people, I'm finding that with chronic inflammation or absolute iron deficiency, they're the people who are struggling with binge eating, who are struggling with sweet foods, who are struggling with carbohydrate addiction. And the solution isn't to do cognitive behavioral therapy and, you know, sort of challenge them and accuse people of being weak-willed. The solution is to treat the cause of the inflammation or to restore the problem with the iron deficiency. When that happens, the body can then synthesize the appropriate amount of neurotransmitters, including dopamine, and then you actually lift the depression. And I've lost count of the number of patients I've had who they haven't necessarily been chronically inflamed, but if they're low in iron, usually females, through pregnancy, you lose blood in labor. You know, the fetus is a little parasite that takes blood away, and if you're menstruating, then you can often lose more blood. So females tend to be the ones who are absolutely iron deficient. When I give them an iron infusion, they come back and they often don't say, oh, I've got more energy. They say, I just feel better. Yeah. It's like a weight's been lifted from their shoulders. Their mood has significantly improved. And I think this effect of chronic inflammation involved in the iron pathways and the ability to synthesize neurotransmitters is really poorly understood in medicine.
I think that's absolutely brilliant, and it makes so much sense because you have chronic inflammation, you have acute inflammation, which happens as a temporary response, and you have chronic inflammation that occurs in autoimmune dysregulation, autoimmune conditions that are just rampant right now, from a lot of times coming from our diets, and how that can trap some of that iron and make it less available to us for oxidation. And just to simplify things, for anyone who's coming across some of these concepts for the first time, but the concept that you initially came to with the iron connection to people having weight loss stalls and an inability to lose weight all went back to a lack of heme iron in the diet with one of your patients that you were working with. And I thought some of the stats you brought up were fascinating, that 50%, men eat 50% more red meat than women, which is where all of that, you know, heme iron we get access to. And women tend to not also tend to eat a lot of salads and other foods. And
well, women tend to be more health conscious, and given our current public health messaging is that we actually vilify red meat, who listens to that health message? Well, females, because they care about their health more. And unfortunately, that's they're the population who loses iron through menstruation and through pregnancy and childbirth. They're the population who need more red meat.
Yes, that's what I was going to say, is the fact that men eat more red meat, but then also the fact that you bring up the menstruation and showing in certain tables some of the stats on how much iron loss happens through menstruation, through childbirth, and all of that isn't even, accounted for. And those are sort of two different sides. You have less iron coming in, but then you also have this chronic inflammation that is actually robbing your body of some of that iron that you may be getting.
Yeah, well, even if you have the iron coming in, you just store it in a stockpile that you cannot access.
So if someone, one of the reasons one of the things that I often recommend to people is cut out nuts and cut out dairy if they're having weight loss stalls. But I wonder if the nut connection, is partly because it's a very calorically dense food, but part of it could be that it is, blocking the absorption of some of the iron that's being taken in at the same time, and also causing other, potential auto-inflammatory conditions.
Well, certainly, if it's being co-consumed, then certain plant foods have anti-nutrients that prevent the absorption of real nutrients. So certainly, we know that things like tannins in teas and things like that disturb the absorption of iron. Nuts is an interesting thing for several reasons. First of all, things that people think are nuts are often not nuts. They're often seeds, and they're often very rich in lectins. And even then, the proper nuts may actually still have some lectins. And nuts are often salted. And we know that salt deficiency, or sodium deficiency more precisely, is actually a problem on ketogenic diets, because you lower insulin, you lose more sodium from the body. So people will often be consuming nuts excessively, not because of the nut themselves, but because they're salted and they're actually just desiring that. They're what we call a moreish kind of food. So if you're not taking care of your sodium supplementation, then you may find yourself inadvertently over-consuming nuts. And the simple thing is they are an energy-dense food. So it's if you put too much of them in, it's going to have some effect on your weight loss. And then some people also get significant gastrointestinal distress from the nuts. I'm sure we're probably going to bring it up later, but they're very rich in fiber. And we know that fiber, rather than helping the gut, is responsible for a significant amount of gastrointestinal distress. The very definition of fiber is that it's not digested by the body. It's insoluble. In another word, this is like a malabsorption syndrome. And when we have a look at the evidence, if you increase the fiber in the diet, you increase symptoms of bloating. If you increase fiber in the diet, you increase fecal bulk. You actually worsen symptoms of constipation. And in one experimental trial where they eliminated fiber from the diet, they had there was a study of 63 people, and in one of the group, they had 41 people who ended up going on a 0 fiber diet. And at the start of the study, every one of those 41 had symptoms of constipation. And they had a bunch of other symptoms, including bleeding and pain and bloating and what have you. And in the 0 fiber group, every single one of the participants had a complete elimination of every single symptom of constipation. Moreover, in a high fiber group, they were opening their bowels on average once every 6.83 days. In this other low fiber group, they were opening their bowels every day.
Right.
So this whole notion that fiber is necessary for good gut health is not premised on any good quality evidence. And the best quality evidence we have is exactly the contrary.
Yeah, I remember the first time I saw one of your presentations and you showed that chart, and it was showing, the bar chart and how low they were, the people who weren't eating fiber. And to see that visually represented was a huge shocker for me because of how we're taught to think of fiber. Now, just before we go on to the fiber topic, so we first addressed all of the iron issues with regards to keto. Now, what about women who are doing carnivore for the purpose of weight loss and they are gaining weight or not seeing results?
The most common problem is the continued consumption of dairy on carnivore. And I mean, strictly speaking, that is an animal type product, and that falls under the under the remit of a carnivore diet. But and not only that, it can also be responsible for constipation, which is very interesting. So the metabolism of the beta-casein in dairy is theorized to actually lead to a lectin-like component, and it sort of has an opiate-like effect as well, which we know that opiates do affect the gut in terms of reducing gastric motility and causing constipation. So almost always, people who are struggling to lose weight on an animal-based diet are over-consuming dairy. And interestingly, that can also include A2 dairy, which we generally consider to be a better option.
Right.
So in general, if somebody's on an animal-based diet, they're struggling to lose weight, my first recommendation is to cut out the dairy.
So your goal is to get the inflammation down as much as possible from the beginning.
Well, yeah, look, we don't really know whether the dairy is just because it's very easy to eat and very easy to overconsume, and it's energy dense, or is it actually contributing to a degree of inflammation that's inhibiting your energy pathways via iron sequestration and so on and so forth. And I don't think we've fully nutted out all the details, but certainly empirically when we look at our patients and anecdotally, it seems to be that cutting out dairy leads to weight loss.
Absolutely. Now, what about people who have cut out the dairy? Because I do see that a lot of the women that ask me about it. It's hard for me to answer because my weight loss was, all through keto. But typically what I'll tell them is that if they are seeing the scale go up and they are only eating strict like meat and water or more strict carnivore, no dairy, that typically some of that is the fact that they are restoring a lot of protein loss in the body, restoring bone mass, and restoring a lot of the body from chronic, restriction of protein.
That is absolutely the reason. That is absolutely the reason. So I think we have to make sure people focus on sometimes the non-scale victories.
Right.
So, and you'll know in most of these people who are saying the scales aren't moving, you'll say, how are your clothes? They're saying, oh, sure, the belt's coming in. I'm buying new clothes, but the scale's not moving. And so it's the lean tissues are increasing and the fat tissue is reducing. And the major reason is because an animal-based diet tends to be an incredibly protein-rich diet.
Mm-hmm.
And we know that the more protein you stuff into the body, then the more muscle you build. So we've actually got very good evidence that even if we take people on a protein intake of about 1.8 grams per kilogram per day for the same exercise program, and understand that the RDI for protein is about 0.8. So this is already over double the RDI. Then if we increase that to over 3 grams per kilogram per day, their muscle will increase. And they've done some really interesting studies on protein overfeeding studies where they've monitored body composition, and they've found that even when you give protein as excess calories in some of these studies, the lean muscle increased, but the fat tissue, the adipose tissue, did not. And that's just the muscle tissue. Let's have a look at bone tissue. We actually know that a prerequisite for reversing osteoporosis and increasing bone mineral density is a high protein diet. So back in 2002, I think the authors were Dawson and Hughes, a study looking at what would happen if they supplemented calcium citrate and vitamin D from memory. And they only used a population of over 65s, males and females. And this female population was postmenopausal. And then they did something clever. They stratified them to their protein intake into tertiles, into thirds. And they looked at their bone mineral density over 3 years using DEXA scanning, which is the most accurate form of assessing for bone mineral density. And what they found is that in the highest protein group, they were able to reverse osteoporosis.
Wow.
So, and it was protein dependent. In the lowest protein group, they lost. Highest protein group, they gained. And this makes perfect sense when you understand what bone is. Bone is basically mineralized protein. So protein strands and fibrils make up 40% of the dry weight of bone. So bone is essentially a proteinaceous structure with a bit of calcium and these other things stuck in between it. So if you're on a high protein diet, your bone mineral density is going to increase. So your scales aren't going down. That's not a problem. That probably means your bones are stronger. So the scales aren't going down. You're probably putting on more muscle as well. So I think in some of these, let's focus on the non-scale victories.
Yeah. Yes, I try to reinforce that and explain that the scale can be a measure also of water balance in the body. One of the questions that comes up a lot is about sodium intake, and I'm curious on your opinion of this. I've been posting a lot of research and studies showing that low sodium levels in the body are associated with higher rates of insulin resistance in healthy individuals, and also that our recommended daily intake for sodium at what it is about half of what is the lowest mortality association. But with carnivore, there's a lot of debate about sodium levels, and there's people saying, you know, you need to not supplement with sodium, only add it to your food. There's other people who say you need to be supplementing with sodium. And just across the board, there seems to be a lot of divergence there, with long-term carnivores not supplementing with sodium at all.
Let's address a couple of things. So first of all, let's not move away from the bone for a moment. So the Women's Health Initiative study actually found that deficient intakes of sodium was associated with a statistically significant increased risk of hip fracture.
Okay.
So sodium is also important for bone health. And it's not just sodium, but other electrolytes like potassium and phosphate. So they did a really neat study where they had people on TPN feeding, total parenteral feeding, basically feeding you through a vein. And this is back in the 70s when they didn't quite have the institutional review boards of today, and they could do some interesting stuff. So they said, what happens if we just stop putting potassium in their feed? We'll overfeed them calorically, and we'll see what happens to their muscle formation, their bone density, and their fat tissue. And when you take away the potassium, they completely prevented any formation of bone or lean muscle tissue, and all the excess energy was simply stored as fat. When they took away sodium, it wasn't quite profound. It was about a 2/3 reduction in the formation of lean tissue. And when they took away phosphate, it was again another profound reduction in the formation of lean tissue. But instead, the excess energy, they still had the energy, it was just stored as fat. So these electrolytes are absolutely essential. And I think for people who are especially doing prolonged fasting and wanting to preserve their lean tissues, I think it really speaks to the importance of making sure that you have a appropriate degree of electrolyte supplementation. So we know that in terms of body composition, bone mineral density, bone health, do not overlook your electrolytes. Now you're probably talking about with regards to all-cause mortality and sodium intakes. We know that the lowest risk of death on a population basis occurs when you have a sodium intake of between about 4 to 6 grams per day.
Yes.
Now you have to understand that sodium is not table salt. So sodium only represents about 40% or thereabouts of what is actually in salt, which is sodium chloride. So to get 4 to 6 grams of sodium, you need a significant more amount of salt. So you need, probably 10 grams of salt a day is actually a perfectly reasonable amount. Now, I'll relay a little story when I was an intern. And we used to have to chart fluids for our patients. And we'd try and calculate what their urinary losses were and what we call insensible losses, how much you lose through respiration, how much you lose through sweat, would weigh them, would try and get a balance. And then we'd have to try and calculate exactly how much sodium and potassium and all of this we needed. We actually used to specifically order how much sodium or how much potassium would put back into the bag. The sodium was at a fixed rate. And I used to struggle over this. And one of my senior doctors, he looked at me one day and he goes, Paul, even the dumbest kidney is smarter than the smartest intern. And he was absolutely right. What he meant was it didn't matter what we put into the body. If we put in too much, it really didn't matter. If the kidneys were working properly, they would fix it up. They would deal with it. And that's something that people don't realize, is that the kidneys, when they're working, are absolutely remarkable. And if you're on a healthy diet and your kidneys are functioning well, if you put in a little bit more sodium or a bit more potassium than you need, you're probably going to be okay. There obviously does need to be a caveat, because too much potassium can cause arrhythmias. leading to heart attacks. Too little potassium is problematic, but certainly when it comes to sodium, it's a bit hard to go wrong if you've got functioning kidneys.
Yeah, the only thing I've seen is in some people who are carnivores with regards to sodium, that they talk about waking up a lot in the night to urinate, and so that must, I mean, I find that
So here's the thing about that. That reflects a sodium deficiency.
That's what I thought.
So what happens is sodium is one of the main ions which actually holds fluid in the body. It has an osmotic effect. And if you're deficient, that means that you lose intravascular volume. So your body can't hold onto it, you urinate it out. But then the thirst mechanism says, oh, we don't have enough volume here, you need to drink. So one of the classical symptoms of sodium deficiency is actually that you get very thirsty with a profound amount of urine production, and you can never quite catch up with your thirst. And the ironic thing is that if you have heaps of salt, you'll also be thirsty, because that's the mechanism the body says, oh, we're hypertonic. We've got too much salt in here. We're going to dilute it a little bit.
Right.
So most people don't really register that a sodium deficiency will actually have this other mechanism that will make you thirsty. And there was an interesting study they did at the Australian Institute of Sport several years ago. In athletes, we've got this big focus on making people stay hydrated and drink. And so we're telling athletes, we're going to measure your urine in the morning. It's got to be the right specific gravity, et cetera, et cetera. And if it's not dilute enough, you're not doing the right thing. And these athletes were drinking heaps, and they were peeing all night, and they were getting incredibly sleep disturbed, and it was disturbing their training, and it was having real training impacts. And the people who were pushing the fluid like this, they really don't understand that the job of the kidneys, especially overnight, is to concentrate the urine. And as a doctor, one of the first things that I look for a failing kidney, the easiest thing, is the loss of the ability to concentrate urine overnight. That's one of the first things that we see when the kidney's going kaput, that and leaking protein. So it's, unfortunately, the whole electrolyte thing is misunderstood, not just by, the public, but by a lot of medical people.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for you to share this information, because there are so many carnivores that are confused about sodium in people on keto as well. And it does seem that the research points to supplementing with it, adding it to your food to taste, and also, you may require more of it in different cases, but it's such a vital ion in the body. I mean, you look at every single cell operates through, sodium, potassium, ATPase, and you need it to get anything done. And people have said, if they're hard training athletes, I'm a sports nutrition specialist. You're a sports medicine doctor. You see it all the time that extra exertion comes also with more mineral loss.
Oh, absolutely. We know for a long time that athletes need 3 to 5 grams a day. So Steve Finney's original studies back in the 80s, they found that they had a precipitous decline in physical performance in their participants if they weren't able to maintain their sodium. And the interesting thing is, salting their food to taste was not sufficient to maintain sodium levels. They actually had to have specific, aggressive sodium supplementation such that their performance did not deteriorate secondary to it. And this is interesting, a little bit of a segue here. The supernova study, the famous study done at the Australian race walkers, which quote unquote proves that low carb diet is not good for athletes. Their athletes were not especially well supplemented with sodium.
Oh.
It was absolutely inadequate. And they were actually deficient. They weren't just not sufficiently supplemented with potassium, but their potassium intake was even below the recommended adequate intake as per the dietary guidelines. And further to that, they weren't completely keto adapted anyway. The period was too short. So right there, you've got 3 major reasons why this study was always bound to fail. So if anybody ever holds that study up and says that's the reason, this is proof that keto can't work for athletes, well, that's a fundamentally flawed study.
Right. But for the average person on carnivore, and if you are working with different patients of yours that you tend to suggest that they maintain a good amount of sodium intake in terms of salting their food, and maybe a little extra depending on how they're feeling?
Yeah, so I think most people can get away with salting their food, but they need to be encouraged to salt more generously than they perhaps are used to. And it will generally sort itself out. But certainly athletes can benefit from specific sodium supplementation. And certainly if you're going on a long training ride or something like that, most carnivore athletes I know of will get extra benefit from pushing in that little bit more salt.
Yeah.
You know, a pre-race meal of something like a hamburger patty and some sodium, some salt. And sometimes you can also use mixtures of salt, what we call light salt, or it's got a mixture of sodium and potassium in it. That seems to be beneficial for some athletes. The key thing to remember is that an animal-based diet leads to very low insulin levels.
Yes.
And that low insulin levels means that your body loses more sodium. So it's to appreciate that sodium requirements will go up on any diet that's tending towards being a ketogenic diet.
I love that you bring up the intelligence and sophistication of the kidneys, because of all the organs I've studied, it's my favorite. It's just so sophisticated and complex and amazing, and the way it doesn't reabsorb those electrolytes when your insulin levels are lower. And the study showing that people who were on lower sodium, it was causing insulin resistance, that it's kind of a two-way connection. When you see someone who's carnivore and they say, I get this all the time, they say that they don't want to supplement with sodium because when they do, they retain water, like their fingers swell, or they get like bags under their eyes, or they get this like water retention. Is that a sign of dehydration, or what?
I haven't actually had any patients say that to me, to be perfectly honest. What would be looking at intravascular fluid retention, which is fluid retention within the blood vessels. That keeps the brain, blood circulating to the brain, this kind of thing. We know that it's actually, if you're hyponatremic, you can get more tissue swelling, in the same way that if you have low levels of protein in the body, that can actually lead to tissue swelling. So I'm not sure that I'd put the finger on sodium for that. I would say, in actual fact, if we have a look at a condition like hyponatremia, this is something we often see in athletes. We call it EAH, or exercise-associated hyponatremia. We usually see it in slightly older females who are running a marathon. They're running it quite slowly. They're having a drink at every water station along the route, whether they need to or not. They're often taking anti-inflammatory medication, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which interfere with some of the fluid balance properties of the body, and they end up with so much excess fluid that it actually dilutes the salt, so that we call it hypo, meaning low natremia, and that is a life-threatening condition. And the guy who actually brought this to the attention of the world was Professor Tim Noakes. And he's actually elegantly demonstrated that these sports drinks, despite being electrolyte drinks, you can have a sports drink and still end up with exercise-associated hyponatremia. So this is one of the legacies of this whole Gatorade, Powerade, what have you phase. It's actually killed people. So for people to be worried about these swellings as being a sign of too much salt, for me, that's not something that I've seen clinically. And I'm certainly more concerned, especially in the athletic arena, of people having too little salt, or more realistically, too much fluid without the matching electrolytes.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you for answering that on sodium, because it really seems to be one of those points of endless fascination. The other one being fiber. And for people who are maybe transitioning, I see a lot of people right now transitioning from keto to carnivore. And there's a lot of research that you've done on fiber and how the microbiome shifts and changes and adapts. And one of my favorite charts that I have shows some of the top prebiotic foods in the world are cartilage. And, some of the foods that we get, these like bone-in gelatinous kinds of cuts of beef and meat, we can get a lot of food for the microbiome. So I know you've done research on how the microbiome shifts and
Well,
why.
I think the problem is
fiber.
We need to understand cause and effect. We need to understand association versus causation.
Right.
And we look at different bugs in the gut and we see, oh, that person's in good health. And we see this person who's not in good health, they have this type of microbiota. Therefore, we say, well, that bug must cause the good health, that bug must cause the bad health. Now, what happens if rather than causing the effect, it's just an innocent bystander coming along for the ride? And I'll give you an example. People who are obese tend to have an excess, I believe it is, of the, I'm actually having a mental, I'm not sure if it's a Firmicutes. I think it's a Firmicutes filer in people. Bacteroidetes is the other main filer. But I think it's the Firmicutes one, which is associated with obesity.
Yes.
And Bacteroidetes is associated with a lean body composition. Now, if we have a look at a child with epilepsy who's been placed on a ketogenic diet, do you know what phyla of bacteria they change to? They change to the Bacteroidetes group. Now, the question is, did their diet change that? Absolutely. Did their diet also lead to a lean body composition? Absolutely. The change in microbiome is just coming along for the ride. It's not causative. In the same way, when I was in medical school and we had our first class in microbiology, we said, right, we're going to study Staphylococcus aureus today. Everybody, you're going to swab yourself. Where do you swab yourself for Staph aureus? So, you know, do we take a fecal sample? No, that's going to be loaded with E. coli and a bunch of other stuff. We take a swab on the inside of the nose. Why? Because we know that on that surface, that skin surface that's a bit moist, that's going to be conducive to Staph aureus. We're going to be able to grow it. So the bug that grows there will depend on the environment, the humidity, the temperature, the nutrients that are provided. We can change the bugs in your gut within 24 hours by simply feeding you different foods, which feeds the bugs different foods. And if this was a causative effect of your health changing, then your health should literally change overnight. It's the bug, the microbiota largely is reflective of your diet, and it's the diet that gives you the health benefits. And there's some very interesting examples of this. So there's this sugar called trehalose, and it's got a very, its freezing point means that it's very good to be used in frozen dairy products. But it was always difficult to synthesize until about the year 2000, and some Japanese scientists figured out how to manufacture it on an industrial scale. And since then, it's been introduced into the food supply around the world. Now, there's a bug called Clostridium difficile, which comes in different flavors. And we have what we call some epidemic phenotypes of it, which will cause a nasty disease called pseudomembranous colitis. It's actually, it can be a fatal condition. And that feeds, the epidemic strains of that feed on trehalose specifically. And when that is introduced into a country's food supply, that's when we see this condition, this overgrowth of Clostridium difficile really taking off. And it's because these bugs in particular can feed on that better than other pathogens can, so they outcompete them, so they expand in number. So it really shows the point that the bugs that you put in, so taking a prebiotic or a probiotic is pointless if you don't continue feeding it, because it will just be outcompeted and it will die off. And we know this. So in India, they did a study treating something called necrotizing enterocolitis, and they wanted to displace a pathogenic bacteria by giving him another bug. And so they gave him a probiotic, didn't work. So then they said, well, it's because this probiotic doesn't have anything to feed on. What happens if we feed them a probiotic and a food source that this probiotic uses at the same time? And they call it a symbiotic. And then they found that was a damned effective treatment for this condition, necrotizing enterocolitis. So the bugs in your gut depend on what you feed it. And it's along for the ride. And in some cases, we can make arguments that they have certain health impacts. So we know that, you know, the production, the fermentation of fiber by some bacteria produces short-chain fatty acids, which can then be taken up by the cells inside your colon and then turned into ketones and then used as an energy source to increase mucus production or, what have you. But in general, most of the benefits are just purely as surrogate marker, and they're not a direct impact of the bacteria themselves.
Right. And it's so fascinating that these short chain sort of butyrates, that ketones, beta hydroxybutyrate is a form of that. It's really amazing.
Yeah. So the interesting thing is everybody believes, if I have lots of fiber, I can produce short chain fatty acids and that will improve the health of my colon. The cells lining it will have more energy and they'll be healthier. And that, strictly speaking, is true for those few cells in the immediate vicinity of those short chain fatty acids, because you've got meters and meters and meters of intestine, and the region where the short chain fatty acids are produced is only right down the very end, and it's only very few of the colonocytes, the cells, that are going to be getting any benefit from that at all. And we know that they derive their benefit after they're converted into ketones. So rather than providing the ketones via short chain fatty acids in a very patchy and limited distribution, what would happen if you were in systemic ketosis? If you had circulating ketones around the body? Well, that has potential to supply every single cell lining your colonocytes with an energy source. And that's why the state of ketosis makes inherently much more sense than feeding somebody fiber that's going to have these other side effects, including bloating and constipation.
Right. Now, if someone is making the transition from keto to carnivore and they're eliminating all of these other foods, or especially plant foods, and is there an expected transition period there? If they maybe are going to experience, you see a lot of people experience, all kinds of digestive ranges and bloating, and on the one hand, constipation, the other end of the spectrum, Joe Rogan's, experience. So what is happening there in that transition?
So we can usually point our finger on it. So constipation almost always is a dairy problem. And it's also a perception problem. So I had a patient today who said, I'm constipated. And I said, okay, tell me about it. Do you have pain? No. Okay. Do you have bloating? No. Is there anything that you feel uncomfortable with? No. Okay. Why are you constipated? I'm not going as often. I used to go twice a day and now I'm not. And it's really small. And it's like, okay, well, they're all predictable changes. It's very common on carnivore to go once a day, to go once every 2 days, because you're not putting much roughage into the system. You're not having much to come through to pass through the system. And that's absolutely fine. And it will be smaller volume by definition. Now, historically, people on a high fiber diet, if they're having rabbit pellets come out, then they're constipated because there's a lot more behind it. But on carnivore, that might be the sum total of your fecal mass. So if you have no pain, if you have no bloating, if you have no symptoms, no discomfort, then, and you're going every day or every other day and there's no unpleasant sensations, is that really a problem?
Right. And so much more is being utilized as well from those foods, as opposed to, like you were saying, the definition of fiber is that it's indigestible, it's insoluble.
I had the pleasure of doing 2 colorectal surgery terms during my training. But it was insightful. So we see people with colostomy bags. And if you speak to people with a colostomy bag, they will tell you that what ends up in that bag is a direct reflection of what they eat. If they only eat meat, and we need to bust one of these horrible myths that's been on for forever. People talk about rotting meat in the gut.
Yes.
This could be not further from the truth. If I think about any of these patients, and I used to chat to the patients on the ward, and I had to immerse myself for months at a time in colorectal and stoma bags and things like this. So these kind of topics do come up. If they eat meat, you get a bit of fluid in the bag, nothing else. If you eat vegetable matter, Well, you can tell exactly what you had because you will see it, and it often comes out. People know if you eat corn. People know if you eat certain foods, the body doesn't digest it. It comes through en masse. So the thing about meat is it's so beautifully digested that there's not going to be much residual that comes through.
Now, I want to ask you, shifting gears a little bit, about protein and fat versus carbs and how we look at all of these different groups in terms of what they do for the body. So, you know, we tend to think of carbs and fats as energy and protein as building blocks for our tissues, bones, muscle, and enzymes, as well as other, you know, lipoproteins and things in the body. Why is it that, I mean, it seems that if we're looking at weight loss, I know that you've talked about, okay, so keto diets train the body to generate ketones and burn fat, but you still need a caloric deficit. But what's interesting about low carb and keto is that if you are mostly eating protein and fat, and carnivore as well, your body is making use of that, and you can't really, even though carbs and fats are both carbohydrates on a molecular level with these, you know, high carbon bonds, these bonds between, high energy bonds between them that are broken up in the Krebs cycle, fats are also essential fats, and we also utilize fats in order to make a lot of our cell membranes, a lot of our, you know, lipoproteins, all of these steroid-based hormones that we need in the body. So protein and fat, where fat is energy, but it's also more than just energy, right? And then you have protein, which has this incredible thermic effect to it. So you can see that with these things in mind, that someone on a protein and fat diet is going to also get some additional benefits, you know, that will help them in their weight loss, in addition to training the body to become fat fueled.
First of all, I love the biochemistry coming through there, and congratulations on, now maybe you should mention what you've actually just finished recently.
My biomedical science program at the University of Toronto.
So anyway, full kudos for that. So you and Richard Morris will have to get together.
Yeah,
so,
I think he's studying biochemistry in Australia, right?
Yes. So
yeah.
It's all topsy-turvy down here, but you know, Richard's a smart guy, and I think he's killing it. But so there's a lot to unpack from there. So we've basically got the three major macronutrients: carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And we've always existed for a long time, and I say we as a medical profession, with the assumption that carbohydrates is an essential source of energy, but it's absolutely crap. There is no obligate need for carbohydrates in the diet whatsoever. There is an obligate need for glucose.
Yes.
But what glucose we need, we can make. In actual fact, if you take a fat molecule, a triglyceride, the backbone of that glycerol can be converted into glucose, and there's amino acids that can be used to generate glucose, the process of gluconeogenesis. So we can make all the glucose, or we can make the carbohydrate we need. We don't need to eat it. And that's a key point. There is no essential obligation for an obligate intake of carbohydrates. Yeah. Now, when it comes to fat and protein, I think we have actually got the balance wrong in the past. And we've really pushed the fat. And we've seen these bulletproof coffees come and hopefully go. And like all this emphasis on stuffing the fat in. But the thing is, I mean, and you're absolutely right, fat is an essential nutrient. And we see that with the story that Steve Finney will often tell about explorers. When the rabbits are too lean, they don't have enough fat and you get ill. Now, that's not evidence of protein toxicity. That's evidence of fat deficiency. And that's proof that fat is an essential nutrient. But I think we've actually got the balance wrong in the past, in the recent past, and we've focused too much on fat and not enough on protein. You mentioned the thermic effects of protein. There's studies that demonstrate it is very hard to gain weight with protein overfeeding, in part because of the thermic effect, where you'll just increase your resting energy metabolism, and you won't end up storing it very efficiently. It's very difficult to store the energy from protein. It's a cumbersome process compared to storing carbohydrates as far as the body's concerned. So I like to think that I tend to now, for me personally, at least in my patients, I recommend a higher protein diet because I know that will support the lean tissues, that will support the bone, and that will also support all the enzymes. If we actually have a look at the original studies that determined that you only needed 0.8 grams per kilogram per day of protein, that was based solely, and that this research was done on 18-year-old American males, for what it's worth, so it's hardly applicable, and they just sort of extrapolate that to the rest of the population. But it was also only based on the use of protein as a substrate, as a building block substrate for making things, and it really ignored any role it has in enzymatic processes, and enzymes are proteins, peptides, and so on and so forth. So protein needs have been grossly underestimated. When we actually have a look at the research, we have a look at people having, 5 times the RDI of protein without any evidence of adverse effect. We're talking about protein or something, weren't we?
Protein and fats, calories, and how, we utilize so much of the protein and the thermic effect. I think you were onto the thermic effect of protein and how we utilize that, but also how fat we utilize in the body too. And I really wanted the question also to be about protein turnover as well. If we can.
And I'm just talking about how when you have 5 times, so in the studies, if you're having 5 times the RDI of protein per day, there's absolutely no evidence of any deleterious impacts. So we can have far higher protein intakes than we've been recommending. And the evidence in terms of them being bad for the kidneys doesn't really exist. And the evidence for it in terms of being bad for bone health, well, that's complete and utter hogwash, because we know that high protein diets are actually a prerequisite for restoration of bone health. So actually one thing that we were going to mention before, so we talked about different gut effects on carnivore, and we didn't specifically mention it, was diarrhea.
Yeah, the Joe Rogan effect.
Yeah, so the most common reason for this is excess histamine consumption.
Oh, that's
so histamine is what we call a biogenic amine, and it's an inflammatory molecule. And it's actually produced, you have an amino acid called histidine, and when it gets acted upon by bacteria, that will convert histidine to histamine. And if we consume it, then we'll have these kind of inflammatory effects, one of them being diarrhea. And there's a lot of foods on a carnivore diet that can actually inadvertently be high in histamine. So deep water fish, so things like mackerel and sardines are particularly renowned for it. And I suspect this probably just reflects that they're probably an improper cold chain. They might not have been fresh frozen straight away, and they've had a bit of bacteria act on them for a period of time. If we have a look at meats, aged meat is particularly problematic. So we all love our aged steaks and things like that. Well, if you're a problem with inflammation or with diarrhea, that's the exact worst thing you could be having. You want to have your meat as fresh as possible. So you'd like to have it immediately after slaughter. You'd like to have it frozen as quick as possible. There's also some things that are anything that's fermented. So a lot of preserved meats, so things like kefir, things like yogurt, things like sauerkraut, they're all fermented, and by definition, they're going to have bacteria that acts on any of the histidine amino acid that may be present. So as a rough rule of thumb, if you have diarrhea as a side effect, that's unusual. And the first thing I always look at is eliminating the foods that contain high histamine content, and that usually fixes it.
That's great that you mentioned that. I know a lot of people probably heard about Joe Rogan's experience, and it sounds like it might have something to do with that. And I also get a lot of questions about carnivore and histamine. So that's great. Just going back to the protein and fat calories. So the way that we measure calories has traditionally been in this BOM calorie meter, right? And it's about the energy given off and the heat when these foods are burned. But our body utilizes calories and food in a much different way, right? In the way that we break down protein and utilize the amino acids, and we utilize a lot of the fats that we eat as well. So people are getting that added benefit from eating protein and fat that they don't from eating carbs, because they form the basis of all of these essential molecules in the body, these lipoproteins, these cell wall membranes, you know, all of these steroid hormones that we need, all of our sex hormones. A lot of it comes from that. I know you said that we got it wrong initially by emphasizing fat more than protein, but there still is a lot of benefit from incorporating a lot of healthy
Oh yeah, and you still need your fats. And I mean, I guess if we have a look at lipids in general, cholesterol is the poster child for where we got it wrong. Don't eat cholesterol, you'll die. Now it's, you know, as far as the United States drug guidelines go, or the dietary guidelines rather, they say cholesterol is now no longer a nutrient of concern. What does that mean? That means you can swim in it. I mean, and you couldn't have a bigger about face if you tried. So, and that's absolutely true. You know, fats are essential, just as proteins are essential. But I think we can overconsume fat, given that they are so energy dense.
Yes.
And I think that can often slow weight loss.
Right. Now, I know that you have spoken a lot about cholesterol and how cholesterol molecules are dangerous for us when they become glycated and oxidized from a high carb diet, from oxidative stress, from free radical damage, and all of this. And you've spoken about how those molecules then become unrecognizable by the liver. I'm curious, because you've drawn the connection between the macrophages and atherosclerosis, and these fluffy molecules that absorb, you know, these molecules that have been glycated and oxidized. What is your opinion on autophagy and incorporating intermittent fasting or fasting into, you know, a keto or carnivorous lifestyle, and can it help assist with correcting some of those corrupted sort of lipids?
Well, first of all, a very potent stimulus for what we call autophagy is actually exercise.
Yes.
And for me, I would much rather exercise regularly than go on prolonged fasting. Right. And I also see prolonged fasting as having some issues, especially in the elderly population. So as you age, it becomes more important to build tissues. So the balance between what we call catabolism, where we're tearing things down, and anabolism, where we're making it up, it's really thrown in favor of tearing things down with aging. And prolonged periods of fasting essentially lead to, you know, increased degradation of these tissues. And for my mind, healthy aging is about maintaining lean tissue, maintaining bone mass, maintaining the healthy tissues of the body. And I think prolonged fasting absolutely works counter to that. And I think if you're in a ketogenic state on a healthy diet with regular exercising, I think that takes care of autophagy enough. Yeah. And I don't recommend more than a 24-hour fast in my elderly patients for that reason. Now, there may be some specific circumstances with specific pathologies where those recommendations would be different. But in general, as a routine rule, I'm very comfortable with people having 1 meal a day, 2 meals a day, having no more than 24 hours in between food. And I think that means that they're still eating enough, frequently enough, such that they can maintain their healthy tissues.
Right. And you are naturally going back into the post-absorptive state likely more quickly, and, you know, just eating 2 meals a day, not snacking, you get over 144 hours fasted in that fasted state during the week that you're not consuming food. And that already, you know, autophagy is not an on and off switch. It's really a spectrum, which, like you said, you're switching on more with exercise, with healthy movement. but also just not perpetually eating helps your
Yeah.
body to be able to turn over a lot of cellular content. You know, it's that there's somewhere between 200 to 400 grams of protein that is turned over in our cells, you know, daily, just from natural processes of misfolded organelles, misfolded proteins and damaged organelles that are
And then
being
recycled.
right?
And this is also premised on being in a healthy diet. So if you're saying, I don't want to do that, I still want to have my Krispy Kremes and Twinkies and eat whatnot, then you are certainly going to benefit from having prolonged fasting periods, a la Jason Fung. And I certainly think there is a role for intermittent fasting in certain groups of people. But people who are exercising well and eating healthily aren't always there.
Sorry, you cut out the last second.
So I think the benefits of fasting, I don't think they're as large in people who are exercising regularly and eating well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a great conclusion, and it makes so much sense. Now, where do you stand on the fat versus protein debate? I know we touched on it a bit, but there are a lot of sort of groups like Paleomedicina that really, really emphasize a 2-to-1 or, you know, really big emphasis on fats for healing. Now, what is your opinion on that?
Look, some fats are particularly beneficial for healing autoimmune conditions, and they're not really the fats, but things that contain phosphatidylcholine. So phosphatidylcholine is very rich in, say, egg yolks, and that's a key ingredient of the mucus lining of our stomachs, which contains about 70% phosphatidylcholine. So if you're having foods that are, and we know saturated fats can be protective for the gut lining and things like that. So if you've got autoimmune diseases, and certainly a high fat consumption is going to be beneficial, but I personally don't subscribe to any fixed ratios. I haven't seen any research that has convinced me one way or the other. And in my patients with autoimmune disease, I haven't observed less optimal outcomes in people who aren't pushing the fat in. I think there's a whole lot of other things that Paleomedicina does that is often overlooked. Everybody just focuses on the diet. But most people don't talk about the fact that they talk about, you know, almost certain they would, about the soaps, the shampoos, the toothpastes and things like that you use, because these are also other exposures to antigenic proteins like gluten that you can get in your body. Most people don't realize that the risk of, if you use lipstick, the risk of developing lupus is increased by almost double. The reason being lipstick often contains gluten. Most people don't realize that you have, you know, your toothpaste might contain you know, nanoparticles like zinc oxide, which are known to increase intestinal permeability. Most people don't realize that their shampoo may contain wheat protein, which, if you have psoriasis or dandruff or a break in your scalp, is going to actually potentially expose it to the immune system. So there's a lot more to controlling immune reactions than diet and how much fat and how much protein you have. And I honestly think most people would be better off you know, taking a chill pill a little bit and just going with what their body feels like and making sure that they're paying attention to these other multitude of factors.
Right. That's absolutely a great answer. There's so many little debates and things in the carnivore space that I think are great for dialogue and discussion, you know, to keep us learning, keep us curious about all these different things. And, you know, science is never settled, right? So we're always learning from each other. We're always, you know, our own individual experiments. And it's amazing just to be in this space, to be learning from incredible people like yourself, incredible minds like yourself.
Well, I'm always learning too. I'm changing my mind.
Right.
So, I mean, in the last 12 months, I've done a complete about turn on omega-6 fats.
Yes, that was my next question.
Well,
I'd love to know your quick take on it. I know it's getting late there for you.
So, well, I think this will be a nice one to finish on. So we recommend that people don't have seed oils and omega-6 vegetable oils, ostensibly because they contain high contents of omega-6 fats. But when we look at the data, it doesn't seem to be the omega-6 fats which is actually a problem. The reason we think they could be a problem is because they're a precursor to something called arachidonic acid, which itself is a precursor to several inflammatory chemicals within the body. However, just because you end up with high levels of arachidonic acid doesn't mean that you'll end up converting that into these inflammatory chemicals, because it needs an inflammatory trigger. And the interesting thing is, if we put people on a low carbohydrate diet, their level of arachidonic acid can actually increase. And the reason it's increasing is because you're taking away the inflammatory trigger, so less of the arachidonic acid is being converted into these inflammatory downstream substrates or products. So the real problem that happens with vegetable oils is not that it contains omega-6, but they're liquid because they have double bonds, which are prone to oxidation. And when you ingest those oxidized products, they get taken up into the chylomicrons in absorption, and they get distributed through your body. We know they can be incorporated into your LDL molecules, and we know they can actually cause physical damage to the liver, and they're associated with the development of insulin resistance. And omega-3 oils, fish oils, are also prone to this oxidation. Anything that's liquid, any lipid that's liquid, has to have double bonds, and those double bonds are prone to oxidation. And omega-3 fats, in actual fact, are more prone to oxidation than omega-6 fats, just because of their chemical structure. So if you're having fish oils, so there was an independent lab analysis that was done in Sydney a couple of years back. The researchers went around and purchased from 2 Sydney pharmacies, and they tested them for oxidation products. And there was a huge variation in the degree of oxidation. So they rated as something called Totox, and it was ranging from about 10 to 130. But the simple fact is they were all oxidized. They all had degrees of oxidation. Now, if you were to eat a piece of fish, if that fish was rotten, if it was rancid, so rancidity is the definition of fat oxidation in food. Cold bottle, it will still be oxidized. So if we have a look at a study on walnut oil, within a matter of hours, it was extensively oxidized. If we have a look at olive oil is 70% oleic acid. It has a single double bond. So it's only got one bond prone to oxidation, but that too is subject to oxidation. So olive oil itself is really only a halfway house between saturated fats, which have very good resistance to oxidation, and vegetable and seed oils, which we should avoid as much as we possibly can. So in general, if you understand that the liquidity of a fat is proportional to how many oxidation-prone double bonds it has, then you'll understand the more solid a fat is at room temperature, the better it's going to be for you. The less it's going to be oxidized, the less damage it's going to do. So for my patients, a lot of them, I'll recommend solid animal fats. The more solid it is, the less oxidized it is.
Yes, absolutely. And those saturated fats play such a great role in a low carb keto and carnivore diets. And it's great to see that people's understanding of them is changing, and understanding that they're so good for us in our diets and having that. So
well, I think it's fantastic that we know that saturated fats are good, but it is sure as heck controversial for me to turn around and say that the olive oil is not as good. And I've certainly got a little bit of flaming for that one, but I'm hoping that when people start to understand and look at the literature and actually see that olive oil, even the day after it's been pressed, is oxidized, and irrespective of whether it's in a glass bottle or not, it's impossible. You can have lower levels of oxidation, but it still will be oxidized to a degree. And in actual fact, there's no clear evidence that olive oil offers any particular health benefits over saturated fats.
Right. Yeah. It's I think it's an interesting oil. I'm not sure why I mean, I can understand why it's gotten so much publicity over the years of being so healthy, but the vast majority of people are cooking with it, and they need to know which fats they should be cooking with instead.
Mm. Well, I don't even recommend it for salads. And the simple reason it's gotten so popular is not because it's so healthy, but I perceive that it's been considered a halfway house between a high-fat camp and a low-fat camp.
Right.
And it's sort of like nobody wants to argue. We all want to agree on something. And olive oil was somewhere in the middle. And, you know, the Mediterranean diet, or which whatever that is, or what it represents, which is something of a mythology, has now taken on this status as an incredibly healthy diet. And olive oil is considered an essential part of that. So by default, we meaning doctors and medical professionals, treat olive oil like it's the simple fact is there's no evidence to support this.
Right. That's great. Well, fascinating as a topic as that is, the last question I want to ask you is, what do you recommend in general with your clients and patients when doing a carnivore or keto lifestyle? And I know you do a carnivore lifestyle yourself. So what do you like to see when they ask for how to get started and just their protein to fat grams? Because it sounds like you have your own conclusions on that.
No, I actually don't like counting macros.
Okay.
I'm sure it drives some of my patients spare.
For
I like real
beginners, I think,
foods.
to have some kind of like idea, you know, when they don't know what their hunger signaling is, when they don't know what a portion should look like on their plate.
Well, I give my patients a book that I've developed. It's 10,000 words. So, and that answers most questions they could possibly have, and it's quite well. It's a reference in itself, and you know, it covers topics from how much salt do you need, how do I know if I'm really hungry, how do I know how much is this, you know, how often should I eat. So these topics are all covered within that. But as a general rule of thumb, if I'm giving people, I like to give people foods to eat, but not proportions. And it's like, if you're eating things from this list, then you will be fine. And I'll have instructions that you don't have to go out and seek fat, but nor do I want you to trim the fat off your food.
Right.
And if you're going to be cooking it, I want you to cook it in fat, and I'm very precise about the types of fat that I want you to use, but I don't make you count it. I believe if you are eating food as it's been packaged by nature, that comes with the right proportions of protein and fat. Yes. So people, the way they used to eat chicken, they have these genetically bred chickens with massive breasts and they cut the skin off, then it's all protein and no fat. Whereas if you're having a chicken wing with the skin on, then you've got a good balance of fat and meat there. If you're having lamb chops, if you cut the fat off, then not so good. If you leave the fat on there, then there's a really nice mixture of fat and protein. So I think the way that food is being packaged by Mother Nature has pretty much hit the proportions right. And I really don't give my patients any more specific instruction than that. Basically, don't eat naked protein. Make sure that the fat that was originally with that protein is still there. And if you have to eat lean meat because that's the way it's sold in the shop, then you can make sure you cook it in beef dripping or something like that to compensate.
That's exactly what I do. If it's a leaner cut, I add like a buttery hollandaise or some butter to it. And otherwise, just eat the meat as it is, the eggs whole as they come and all that. Well, thank you so much for being here, Dr. Mason. Can you tell us where we can find your work online? I know you're working on a book as well.
Oh, that's slow progress, but yeah, I will hopefully in the next 2 to 3 years. And I only say that half facetiously, I'll be done with that. We're actually on Low Carb Down Under website, lowcarbdownunder.com.au. They post a lot of lectures, so not just my lectures, but a lot of great ones from around the world. We're actually having a conference in Sydney, if I can give that a shout out. That's on the 9th of May at the University of Sydney, 2020. So tickets can be bought online for that. So if you're in the town, then please get yourself along. It'll be great to see some more faces there. Aside for that, I'm on Twitter, and I've just started poking a few people on Twitter from time to time. I'm not on it every day. I'm fairly busy, but I do like to engage. And if you give me a shout out or ask me a question, if I do see it, I will answer. So very, very happy to engage.
And you have a YouTube channel as well, which aggregates a lot of your different lectures and presentations as well. I'll put a link to that because it's got some great videos on there for anyone who wants to take a deeper dive into some of the topics we covered today. But thank you so much for being here again with us on Fast Keto, Dr. Mason.
Always a pleasure, and thanks for having me again, Vanessa. And congratulations on knowing more about biochemistry than anybody else.
Thank you. All right, guys, thank you so much for watching the episode today, for tuning in. If you're listening over on iTunes, it was such an honor to have Dr. Paul Mason joining us again on the podcast. He is so incredibly knowledgeable, researched, well-read, and just an awesome doctor that has so much great information about carnivore, about women's health, about men's health, and so many intricacies of why these approaches, why keto, low carb, carnivore all work so well for so many people in terms of getting great results in their health. So it was such an honor to have him on again. Now, if you are struggling with your own keto journey, your own approach to keto or carnivore, I have a program that I've been running for years, and it is the 28-Day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. You can check it out at ketogenicgirl.com. And all of the meal plans on the website come with my support and guidance and coaching to answer any questions that you have when you are either brand new to keto and carnivore, or keto carnivore or low carb, or you've been doing it for a while but you are stalled, you're not getting the results that you want. I am here to be your coach and guide and support you and answer any questions that you have and bring you a framework and meal plan that you can use personally to get and see those results. So you can check that out at ketogenicgirl.com. And if you like the episode, leave a comment, share it with someone that you think would enjoy it too. And until the next episode, have a fat-fueled rest of your day.